Welcome to part 2 of our video series about the history of fighting games. In the last episode, we went over a massive time frame, starting with the earliest possible origins of fighting games and closing off with the late 80s. In this part, we'll enter the so-called golden age of fighting games, an era when the genre expanded beyond what anyone could have imagined. There is a lot to go over. In just a few years, the 90s gave us more fighting games than the last 2 decades before it. To reflect that, we'll be putting a much bigger focus on a smaller time frame, covering the years from 1990 to 1993. Without further ado, I am your host, Arya from That Blasted Salami. Let's get into this. As we mentioned in the last episode, the 80s was a formative decade for fighting games. It saw many titles that would be crucial in defining the core identity of the genre. Karate Champ brought the appeal of PvP combat to wider audiences. Yi Kung Fu gave us an early taste of the classic arcade mode experience. Finally, there was the original Street Fighter, which introduced special moves and invented a control scheme that Capcom still uses to this day, 35 years later. Important as they are, none of those games reached the kind of success that would tell the rest of the industry, hey, you should also make fighting games. That's why the early 90s was still pretty quiet. The year 1990 in particular was just the calm before the storm. The situation changed dramatically in February of 1991, when Capcom released Street Fighter II. To understate the impact of this game is nigh on impossible. You could say it changed the world, and it still wouldn't be too crazy of an exaggeration. The overwhelming success of Street Fighter II revitalized the arcade business, created a massive demand for fighting games, and led to the creation of a competitive scene. What did it take to achieve that? A unique experience that no other video game had offered before. In fact, it was so foreign to your average arcade goer that most people were just playing arcade mode until a big game magazine made articles about the PvP part of the game. Once that took off, there was no stopping it. Street Fighter II was an almost perfect package as well. Fantastic sprite work, a varied roster of cool characters, and a soundtrack that became an instant classic. The gameplay was also infinitely more refined than in the original game, both by design and partly by accident, as was the case with the combo system. After one of the developers found a bug that lets you link attacks together, they decided to just leave it in, since it was both technical and fun to do. The game wasn't without issues, of course. Most egregiously, the original game featured random damage and stun values on the same attacks, which would get toned down with each edition. The other infamous flaw was in the throw system. You couldn't tech them until later editions, and even then it would only reduce the damage. As bad as that might sound, you have to keep in mind that this game came out over 30 years ago. The Street Fighter II developers were largely pioneers, exploring uncharted territory. Compared to the downsides, it's far more impressive just how many things they got right. Capcom did not let this success go to waste, so within the next 3 years, they released 4 new editions of Street Fighter II. With each new edition, the game would get even better visuals, more content, more refined balance, and super moves. Naturally, the pirates weren't idle either, and were creating bootleg editions of their own. The most famous of them is Rainbow Edition, an insane rendition of Street Fighter II that cranked everything up to 11. Guile got homing sonic booms. Shotos could fill the whole screen with fireballs. Special moves were doable in the air, and it all moved so much faster. As chaotic as it was, Rainbow Edition was so popular that it influenced Capcom to speed up Street Fighter II with the Turbo Edition. Late into 1991, SNK would release their first ever fighting game, the original Fatal Fury, headed by Takashi Nishiyama, who previously directed the original Street Fighter. It was a distinctly different take on the genre compared to Street Fighter II. While Capcom chose to enhance the roster and focus on the Versus mode, Nishiyama wanted to create a spiritual successor to the original Street Fighter, but with more interesting characters and storytelling. That's not to say the gameplay was an afterthought. One of the most distinct features of Fatal Fury is the two-lane combat that allowed players to switch between background and foreground. It also had a lesser-known co-op feature. Whenever a new player joins, the two of you would first have to defeat the stage boss in a 2v1 fight before fighting each other. Fatal Fury didn't achieve the same success as Street Fighter 2, but still performed exceptionally well, pushing SNK to create more fighting games and getting multiple sequels. Fatal Fury 2 released the following year and was the bigger and better version, adding more characters and a new mechanic in desperation moves, which were supers that can only be done when you're low on health. Does that sound familiar? In 1993, Fatal Fury Special would come out and serve as the Ultimate Edition, combining the roster of prior games and adding Ryo from Art of Fighting. Speaking of which, following Fatal Fury, SNK launched 2 more fighting game franchises, starting with the Art of Fighting in 1992, an immensely stylish game that boasted designs from the legendary Shinkiro. Similar to Fatal Fury, it put an emphasis on storytelling, but also flexed SNK's art muscle by zooming in on the action and showing off some of the best sprite work of its time. The gameplay was fairly standard, but it's notable for being the first fighting game with super moves. In 1993, SNK shifted the focus towards more unique gameplay with Samurai Showdown, or Samurai Spirits as it's known in Japan, a weapon-based fighting game set in the Edo period. Partially inspired by Mortal Kombat, they wanted to create a gritty and atmospheric fighting game, which is reflected in stylized visuals, period-appropriate music, and lots of violence. The focus on deadly strikes over combos also feeds into the atmosphere, leading to more methodical yet intense duels. Its signature rage meter is also one of the earliest examples of comeback mechanics. Getting hit will eventually fill and activate your rage, granting your attacks critical damage. Western publishers immediately picked up on a new trend, with Midway being amongst the first. Just a little over a year after the release of Street Fighter 2, they put out a game that would become incredibly influential in its own right. While they weren't pioneers at this point, the developers at Midway, including John Tobias and Ed Boon, did new and shocking things for the genre. For starters, elephant in the room, Mortal Kombat was more violent than anything you've seen in video games at that point, which famously led to the creation of ESRB to rate games for appropriate ages. Was it the first violent video game? No, not at all, but just look at how violent games used to look. And how Mortal Kombat looked.
Scorpion, win.
This brings us to another distinct feature of early Mortal Kombat games, the digitized actors. Instead of cartoony sprites, you were basically looking at real people, which gave the action and gore so much weight. Even by today's standards, some of those finishes are rather gruesome. The gameplay matched the intensity of the visuals. Even though the entire cast had a set of universal moves, they had plenty of cool and unique specials that often involved some superhuman or magic abilities. It was also one of the first fighting games with a juggle system, so if you really knew what you're doing, you can keep opponents in the air and execute flashy combos. The game became an instant hit, so it was immediately followed by a sequel in 1993. Which introduced more universal moves and characters, polished up the combo system, and greatly expanded on everyone's favorite, the fatality system, adding extra finishes and comedic options like babalities or friendships. Much like Street Fighter, it also inspired developers to create a game that could compete with Mortal Kombat. The first one came out just months after the original Mortal Kombat, a mostly forgotten game known as Time Killers. The game pitted a bunch of time-traveling warriors against one another in gruesome battles where you could chop off each other's arms and heads. Sometime later, in August of 1993, Eternal Champions came out. More of a mix between Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter. It's still notable for including some insanely gorgeous art and fatalities so brutal that we can't show most of them without YouTube giving us a hard time. Surprisingly enough, the next MK-inspired title came to us from Japan, the country where this game famously never took off. Survival Arts uses the Capcom button layout and normal blocking, but everything else is like MK on steroids. You can pick up guns and swords from the floor, spawn missiles out your pocket, or blow people up by punching them. This leaves us with the last Mortal Kombat-inspired game for the period, the hilarious Clay Fighter. It started out as just a silly game that parodied other fighters, letting you play as a goofy Elvis impersonator or a literal blob of clay, amongst other things. It was even successful enough to get several sequels and still has a bit of a cult following. The last major milestone in this episode is Virtua Fighter, released in October of 1993. Right around the time when actual 3D in video games started becoming a reality, Sega was one of the first to adopt the technology. After testing human joint animation in Virtua Racing, Yu Suzuki set out to develop a fighting game that would create a whole new subgenre. It was a true breakthrough, not just in terms of technology, but gameplay as well. The use of 3D graphics and motion capture, as rudimentary as they were at the time, allowed the game to present combat in a way that's grounded and authentic. While 2D fighters were all about inventing crazy new powers and over-the-top characters, Virtua Fighter presented you with proper martial arts. It wasn't yet the game we know today, but it laid the groundwork that would get expanded upon and polished up with future titles. It also inspired its own wave of 3D fighting games, but we'll have to leave that for future episodes. Outside of such monumental titles like Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, and Virtua Fighter, there were so many smaller titles that were largely inspired by Capcom's masterpiece, and they also deserve a mention. From lazier knockoffs to more inspired interpretations. The former category had plenty of entries. The unremarkable Power Moves from 1992 was amongst the first to capitalize on Street Fighter's success, a thoroughly forgettable game featuring a Hadouken-throwing protagonist, Joe Karate Man. Body Blows came out a bit later, but didn't have much to offer, outside of some of the most stilted-looking animations and hilariously rough-looking sprites. In 1993, Capcom tried to get a piece of the pie themselves, releasing Martial Champion. Fairly average in almost every way, it only really stands out for the few oddball designs, like the jumping Chinese vampire. In the same year, they put out a fighting game based on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which ended up as just another serviceable fighter that failed to distinguish itself from the others. Last among the more overt clones is Tough Enough, or Dead Dance in Japan. The Western cover has to be one of the ugliest out there, but the game itself was a surprisingly solid Street Fighter clone. What it lacked in innovation, it made up for in solid execution, with both good-looking character designs and smooth, responsive gameplay. On the side of more interesting games, we got World Heroes. The series started out as a fairly uninspired Street Fighter knockoff, but after partnering with SNK during World Heroes 2, the series grew into its own, adding more unique characters and new mechanics. Coming from Capcom themselves, Saturday Night Slam Masters married the already existing genre of wrestling games with flashy fighters. While it still operated on the wrestling rules of ring outs and pinning, the gameplay resembled an interesting mix of free movement with fighting game combat, including a special emphasis on throws, for obvious reasons. Fighter's history has an interesting past. Just like World Heroes, it started off as a clone, to the point where Capcom even felt the need to sue Data East for copyright infringement. While the lawsuit failed, there are some undeniable similarities. However, in 1994, it'd get a sequel that developed the series into a cult classic. And saving the best for last, we have a crazy fighting game from Atlas, where you pick a character, all of whom belong to the same family, to see which one of you is strong enough to replace the current leader, a 78-year-old grandma. Power Instinct came out in late 1993, and threw in some fresh ideas into the pot, like breakable walls, double jumps, and a completely random karaoke mode. Even though the game had many of your standard archetypes, you also have cool weirdos, like the infamous grandma that can transform into her younger self. It's unfortunate that most of these games never released outside of Japan, but with 5 more games in the series, you're bound to hear more about it in future episodes. We had a lot to go through in this episode, so thank you for sticking with us and watching. In part 3, we'll be going through games like The King of Fighters, Killer Instinct, and Tekken. Until next time, this has been Arya from That Blasted Salami, wishing you an excellent day.